report, Setting the Pace, Accelerating and Decelerating Sustainability in Times of Crisis. And you will now be able to download it on our website. Normally, Angelique, Laskewitz, our executive director, would welcome you, but unfortunately, she needs to attend an ICN board meeting as chair of the supervisory board. But she says hi. We wish you all a very warm welcome in these remarkable times. We've been looking forward to this webinar for a couple of weeks now. And again, it was a special year with no physical, only digital AGMs. And we did see the interactivity increase, but it was still limited. Luckily, almost all companies provided an opportunity to ask follow-up questions compared to just over half last year. And this provided room for dialogues instead of monologues, but still interaction is limited if you need to communicate via a chat. Also, we found that digital AGMs are not as well attended as pre-COVID physical meetings. Some AGMs were visited by as little as 5 shareholders. This is in contrast to the lively shareholder meetings of, for example, DSM, Shell, ING, pre-COVID. And we're curious how companies will tackle this decreased interaction with their shareholders in the future. Well, there's definitely still room for innovation, and we've seen several interesting examples this year, such as live call-ins and pre-sending videos. And we would like to challenge companies to take this further next year. I think what has really surprised us as VBDO is the way companies and CEOs have dealt with their organization's specific situation. I mean, each step was closely followed by the public, a sign that society demands responsibility from the private sector. Companies needed to react to this, for example, with Aal de Heze and the delay fine for the suppliers, which they needed to manage, and Booking.com and their COVID support, which they eventually paid back. Well, this year was our 26th year of shareholder engagement, an interesting year for sustainability, not only for the companies we engage with, but also through external pressures. We saw pension funds increasingly scrutinized by their participants for their investments in fossil fuels. Of course, fossil fuel companies significantly pushed by shareholders to increase the rate of transition. The EU is challenging the status quo through regulation on child labor, broader due diligence, and also providing guidance through the taxonomy. We've seen companies lobbying with governments for green recovery, but are they doing enough themselves? Well, we hope to give some insight today, but let's first go to our program. Next slide, please. So I will first dive a bit deeper into the engagement process and our general results, but we've also invited Fidelity International, Terence Tsai, analyst and portfolio manager at Fidelity International, to tell a story on the humanitarian crisis that was forming at sea with stranded seafarers. And he will tell us more about human rights in global trade in times of a pandemic. Then we have Elisabetta Colombo. She's SDGs Product Manager at VE, which is part of Moody's ESG solutions. And she will elaborate on the assessment of companies' human rights approach. She will provide a rater's perspective on these issues. And last but not least, we've invited Robert Takke, Program Manager Diversity and Inclusion at PostNL, and he will give insight in their approach and diversity index. But first, some essentials. Next slide, please. So we have some basic rules. We have 2 hours planned for this webinar, and last year we were a bit short in time with 1 hour. So this time we have taken 2 hours. Let's see if we need it. I hope that you all stay tuned, and let's try to make it an interactive session. This year, if you have a question, please post your question in the chat box, and we will aim to address it during the session. If your question is not answered, we will add it to a Q&A document that we will share afterwards. Good to know is that the webinar is not under Chatham House rules, and a recording of the session will be shared afterwards with the public. Next slide, please. So setting the pace, that's the name of our new report. And with our team, we've heavily discussed what the title of this season's report should be. And what we all agreed upon was the fact that companies really responded differently to this crisis, positively and negatively, and in a different pace. We noticed that some companies were reluctant to commit to something, while others were really taking our advice seriously to learn, develop, and improve. First of all, I would like to thank Paul Polman for providing a foreword to this report and sharing his thoughts on corporate purpose, and the pervading short-termism. Did you know that currently the average holding for shares in a public company is now just 4 months? The average lifespan of a company listed in the S&P 500 is just 15 years, and the average tenure of CEOs is only 4.5 years. It's essential that we break through this together in the coming years. And Paul mentioned several prescriptions to overcome short-termism, and I suggest that you read further in our report. Of course, our report offers more than only our engagement results. We've shared best practices and include interviews with Jan-Willem Vosmeer from Heineken, Diana Visser from Corbion, assistant professor from Tilburg University, Anne Levarre, and Michael Weber from South Pole. And I would love to tell more about these, but I think it's easier if you, again, just download the report. Thank you. Next slide, please. It's important to know that our engagement process has evolved constantly in the past 26 years. We aim to listen to our member base, but also have our ears open to what companies have to say and what they think we can improve. But let's have a look at our yearly engagement process. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So how do we work? At the beginning of the year, we select the ESG teams and provide guidance to the companies in our universe on what we expect from them on each team. This year, our teams were climate adaptation on the environmental dimension, labor condition in the supply chain for the social dimension, and diversity for the governance dimension. Next up, when the annual reports are published in spring, we conduct in-depth research and score the companies on our impact criteria. Following this research, issues and topics are identified, and 7 to 8 questions are formulated in a letter. We arrange calls prior to the AGMs to discuss the questions and explain what we expect. This gives us the opportunity to dive deeper and hear the company's story and situation. After the pre-AGM call, we arrive at 3 final questions to file at the AGM. After the final AGM of the season, we will collect the impact results and write our engagement report. Throughout this process, we always liaise with our sector commission. This is a group of 18 sustainability experts from the field that guide us towards more effective engagements. Essentially, it's our aim to create a long-term dialogue, interactive exchange of ideas with the companies that we engage with. Leonor, could you please click one time? For the second year now, we are now tracking the impact of our engagement, and we categorize companies into 3 categories based upon their scoring on our impact criteria. The categories are lagging, learning, and leading. And after each year, we can see improvements and so on. So how does this work? Well, let's have a look at our results. Next slide, please. Let's first look at the highlights. VBDO asks for factual commitments from the company it engages with. This can, for example, mean more strict climate targets or evaluating and addressing the gender pay gap. And each year we check if companies live up to those commitments they've made the year previous. In 2020, our previous engagement season, 70% of commitments made in 2019 were followed up by the companies. This year, we see that only 44% of commitments have been followed up. We think this might be an effect of the COVID pandemic. At least we have not found another hypothesis. Leonor, could you click one further? So we filed 100 questions at AGMs. This year, a bit less on climate adaptation and a bit more on diversity. We had an increase in questions on, for example, net zero targets, plastics and packaging, and biodiversity. Our commitments stayed relatively steady and are evenly distributed along the categories of filed questions. We aim to ask questions that have an actual impact and trigger a commitment. I can say that we're happy with the 59% success rate of questions that actually lead to a commitment. Good to know is that all the 59 commitments of companies can be read on page 54 and 55 of our report. Next slide, please. So let's go to the results of the first topic, climate adaptation. In 2021, we engaged on the topic of climate adaptation for the 3rd year. Dealing with climate change consists of course, climate mitigation and climate adaptation. and climate mitigation focuses more on preventing global warming, while climate adaptation is focused on becoming resilient and adjusting to the physical impacts of climate change. We have noticed an overall increase in performance of companies on the theme of climate adaptation, and them really getting what the topic means for them. Notably, Signify and Unilever moved from the learning to the leading category. However, it should also be noted that the performance of a significant number of companies has actually declined. But this is also partially due to us having a stricter implementation of our criteria, but also because new companies were added to our engagement scope. Leonel, could you please click one further? As you can see here, this slide categorizes the companies based on their maturity on this theme, as we scored them on our criteria. When comparing sectors, we see that the technology and financial sector are, on the whole, lagging a bit behind. Nonetheless, we see great improvements in these sectors. What I do need to say is that the order of the companies in the blocks is not based on their individual scores. It's random. Next slide, please. So we witnessed an overall improvement in performance of companies on this team. And two trends deserve attention in particular, we think. First, significant progress has been made on the percentage of companies assessing their exposure to all physical climate change impacts. As you can see, 38% of companies assessed these impacts in 2019, and this percentage has now doubled to 78% in 2021. We're very glad to see this trend, because a thorough analysis of climate-related risks and opportunities is paramount to developing a climate adaptation strategy. Secondly, we see an upward trend in the percentage of companies describing their implementation of climate adaptation strategies. When we started engaging on a team in 2019, only 24% of companies had such a policy in place. This percentage rose from 39% in 2020 and now to 58% in 2021. This year, we have not invited a speaker on the topic of climate adaptation, but we did invite two expert speakers for the second engagement focus team, labor conditions. But now let me introduce to you our first speaker, Terence Tsai, analyst and portfolio manager at Fidelity International. In the past couple of months, I've had very interesting discussions with Terence on the project that he started, the Seafarer statement. Terence started hearing about disruptions and human rights violations and took immediate and international action. And I think he has a very interesting story, I must say. Terence, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mart. Hi, everyone. My name is Terence. I'm an equity investor with Fidelity based in Hong Kong. And I'm really happy that I got the invitation today to speak with you about shipping, which is one of the sectors that I covered in my role as analyst last year. And when I first started the job of looking at the shipping sector, I probably, like a lot of people, I referred to everything as boats. They all looked the same to me. I couldn't tell them apart from one another. But after over 2 years of following the industry, I think I can actually tell the difference between a tanker and a dry bulk vessel. So that's been a minor improvement in my time as an investor. In terms of shipping, especially for investors, not many people pay attention to shipping as an industry until maybe recently. We've seen the stock prices of shipping companies really soar in the last 12 months. For example, for Maersk, it's up about 134%. As I last checked. Companies in Asia that I cover, the Taiwanese companies like Yangming, Wanhai, Evergreen, they're up 27 times or 18 times and 16 times respectively in just the last 12 months. Costco, based in China, is up about 8 times last year. So it's been a huge, very profitable year for shipping companies. But while the earnings and stock prices of these shipping companies have soared, unfortunately, the treatment of the very people who enable this has deteriorated. And I'm talking about the seafarers, the crew who man the ships and are responsible for our cargoes. We can go on to the next slide. The next one, please. So in a nutshell, shipping is the lifeblood of global trade. Nearly 90% of the world trade is enabled by shipping. So if you need to make steel, you need iron ore that's shipped through dry bulk vessels. You need to generate electricity, you need coal in your power plants. That's also shipped by dry bulk vessels. Soybeans for consumption or for animal feed, also shipped on dry bulk vessels. You need gas for your cars, oil tankers, such as the large VLCCs, which stands for very large crude carriers, that transport crude oil from oil-producing countries like the Middle East and the U.S. to our local communities. If you want to buy a Christmas present that's coming up this year, most of the manufacturing is in China, and you have to ship them from China to wherever you're based in Europe and the U.S., where consumption is starting to recover. There are about 1.6 million seafarers globally, and they ensure the safety and reliability of our cargoes. Most of them are from developing countries, China, Russia, Philippines, and India. They work 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day in some of the most dangerous working environments. Next slide, please. And since the beginning of COVID-19, when the pandemic hit, travel restrictions and border closures imposed by governments around the world caused significant hurdles to crew change, meaning people can't get off the ship, and people can't get on the ship. So as a result, many seafarers on board the ships are forced to work on extended contracts because they're unable to return home. The lack of flights have also made repatriation of seafarers a logistical nightmare. In the industry, shipping companies limit continuous work on a ship to just 9 months. As you can imagine, because of the long hours and the continuous work that you have to face as a seafarer on board a ship. The regulatory maximum is 11 months. So the shipping industry is lower than that because they understand the demanding nature of the job. Yet many seafarers are forced to work for over 17 months, some even as long as 2 years. And so you can imagine the physical exhaustion adds to the mental stress of being away from their families and from land. For many seafarers, when we speak with them, it means the world to them just to get off the ship and walk on land. And also keep in mind, many of these merchant ships, they do not have internet. So if the countries they call on do not allow them to disembark, they may not be able to contact their families at all. And as an analyst, I started hearing the horror stories when I met with the shipping companies, management. On one ship, there was a captain that died of a heart attack, and his crew stored his corpse in the freezer for about 2 weeks before they found a port that would repatriate the body. The CEO of a leading dry bulk company that we invested in told us that one of their captains lost his son, yet it took 2.5 months of jumping through hoops and cutting through red tape to get the captain back home to his family. And this was when a shipping company was willing to pay all the expenses required to get his captain home, and still it took 2.5 months. You can imagine the anguish the father had to go through. So when we first looked at this issue, there were 300,000 seafarers stranded on ships. And it was frightening to see the number of seafarers rise by 1/3 to 400,000 seafarers stranded on ships. And while the headline number is 400,000, you have to remember there's another 400,000 seafarers that are waiting to get on the ship. They have not been able to have a job or a wage for the same amount of time the seafarer was stranded on the ship. And most of these people, these seafarers, choose a life at sea because there are no equal paying opportunities on land where they're from. So they're facing financial difficulties at the same time when the pandemic was happening. Next slide, please. So At Fidelity, we believe that ESG is an integral part of our stock picking process. And so our ESG evaluations and when we look at risk, they're not done by a separate team. They're done by the investors, such as the analysts and portfolio managers, such as myself. We think of ESG as a formalization of evaluating non-financial risk. So I think most of us are familiar with evaluating financial risk. We look at the balance sheet, we look at the cash flow statement, and kind of think of, but in terms of ESG, we try and develop a framework to evaluate the non-financial risk from environmental to governance issues. The core belief is that as long-term investors, companies which are managed sustainably will outperform in the long run. And so when I first came across this crew change crisis as part of my research on shipping stocks, I was quite shocked that this was not talked about. It was not written in sell-side research reports. It was not talked about by asset managers. From my perspective, this was a clear ESG risk that had consequences not just for shipping, but for all the industries that relied on shipping to carry out trade. At the very crux of this is that this is a clear humanitarian crisis. I think first and foremost, that's the easy thing to pick out. Seafarers are essentially forced to work against their will on ships, and those ships have literally become floating prisons. They're kept away from their families, and these practices are in direct violation of maritime law. And COVID is simply used as an excuse to breach the law. And in our view, seafarer rights have to be upheld, right? They were compromised and they need to be upheld no matter the circumstances. And we have to start treating seafarers as human beings with real needs. And on the commercial side, as I mentioned earlier, commercial trade is enabled by shipping. 90% of commercial trade is enabled by shipping, from our consumer goods, agricultural products, energy sources. If the crew change crisis worsens, we could see more workplace accidents, given the mental and physical exhaustion from the seafarers. And this is especially alarming and frightening if you're handling dangerous cargo, such as crude oil or natural gas. Just think about what happened with the Suez Canal and how much disruption it has caused to our global supply chains. Think about if we didn't have seafarers or if they went on a strike, this would have huge repercussions for the rest of the economy. And I think this is the hardest part about our engagement, is trying to warn the community before something bad has happened. We're trying to tell you that if this continues, something bad's going to happen. And it's very hard for people to take action when nothing has, when you can't point to something that's been caused by this seafarer issue. Next slide, please. So as with investing, I think for investors, if you want to be successful, it's arguably more important to know what you don't know than what you already know. And in this case, it is especially important to observe intellectual humility, because I, as an, or my colleagues in an asset manager such as Fidelity, we cannot know the intricacies or the complexities of the situation better than the people on the ground. And we cannot prescribe a solution to this problem. And so we consulted a lot of key maritime organizations, such as the ITF, the ILO, and other UN agencies, to try and understand where we can be helpful as asset managers and where businesses can be helpful to raise awareness, to encourage dialogue. So for the photos you've been seeing on my slides so far, this is a seafarer trust photo competition we organized with ITF called Still at Sea, and it's to recognize the work of our seafarers. And it's been taken, the photos are taken by our seafarers on board ships to kind of to show the world their working conditions. And when we speak with these maritime organizations, we recognize there are areas that investors can be helpful as well. So within our own portfolio holdings, companies we have a large stake in, we identified about 30 companies in the maritime supply chain, from your charterers of ships, so your oil majors, commodity giants, your brands and your retailers that use shipping to get their goods to their customers. We spoke with shipping companies, we spoke with airlines, and we wanted them to know about this issue, and we wanted them to help to the extent possible in mitigating this issue. For example, if you're a charterer of a ship, try to be flexible. Allow your ships to deviate to ports that are more crew change friendly. Consider bearing part of the cost of this additional journey. If you're a shipping company, we want to know that you're doing the absolute best in getting your seafarers back to back to their homes. And for airlines, if it makes economic sense, maybe you can consider adding flights to major ports around the world to facilitate crew changes. And the most important thing is we hope all the stakeholders can appeal to their local governments so that the seafarers can be designated as key workers by the governments. We also led our other asset manager peers to write a letter to the United Nations Secretary General. There are about 2 trillion in AUM in total, and we share our findings and we make suggestions on where we think businesses can be helpful. And then we're also one of the first to sign the Neptune Declaration, which is a cross-industry initiative to improve the welfare of the seafarer. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the engagements that we've been trying to raise through the media, because it has gone under the radar, and we thought it was important for them to know. Next slide, please. So it's been about a year since we've been hitting the table and trying to get the word out on seafarers, and the headline numbers have improved, right? The peak was 400,000. The number of seafarers stranded has now halved to about 200,000 seafarers. The UN also launched what they call a due diligence tool in May, just last month, and it was targeted at businesses. And it actually echoed and mirrored a lot of the suggestions we mentioned in our open letter. But if you ask me, from my perspective, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. We still have 200,000 people stranded at sea, and that's 200,000 too many. And the biggest challenge we face are governments. I think it's an absolute disgrace that less than a third of the UN countries recognize seafarers as key workers. The governments have been so defensive that they restrict the movements of seafarers and their ability to conduct crew change, all in the name of blocking out COVID from their borders and protecting their citizens. And so this means seafarers are not labeled as essential or performing an essential service, or what we call key workers, despite the fact they're clearly providing an essential service. What we're asking our portfolio companies to do when we try to engage them, it's just a Band-Aid. It's slapping a Band-Aid on the wrist bleed, right, on the arterial bleed. And we first need governments to recognize the essential nature of the seafarer profession and designate them as key workers. And I know governments can do this, right, because we don't hear about stranded pilots or stranded air stewardess being trapped in planes. The ugly truth is seafarers tend to originate from developing countries and are from worse off socioeconomic status. And politicians are simply unwilling to expend political capital on this demographic. As a long-term investor, you might take a longer-term view, this affects the sustainability of the shipping industry. seafarers are watching how the world is treating them, and children considering a career at sea are watching how current seafarers are being treated. If we don't rectify this humanely, we could see a shortage in eligible seafarers in the future. And I think as a point of reflection, most of us have the luxury of working from home. We can watch trashy shows on Netflix, and more importantly, we can spend time with our families. I think it's a worthy reminder that seafarers cannot do the same. And even in the tightest of lockdowns, our electricity was running, there was food in the grocery stores, and so COVID-19 emptied the streets, but not the oceans. And I think it's time to show some well-deserved appreciation for our seafarers, who are truly the forgotten essential workers in our fight against COVID-19. Thank you for listening, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Terence. Yeah, again, also that there's still 200,000 seafarers stranded at sea. I think that's while our economies are opening up, there's still a crisis at sea. I think that's yeah, hard to imagine. But also of course, there are horrible stories that you mentioned at the beginning, but also just for investors and the business risk of not having a long-term planning for people to work in those sectors, and of course the importance of being them selected as key workers. Thanks for your story. So there's a question from Xander Urbach, and it's: in what way does the Neptune Declaration or Fidelity help seafarers beyond complying to the law? In other words, do you engage beyond legal compliance?
Sure. So the Neptune Declaration is led by mostly the maritime organizations. So I think I can speak more on Fidelity and our engagement. I think a lot of times we are asked, why don't you choose an exclusionary means of engagement, meaning you set rules where you exclude certain companies if they fail to meet these seafarer-related, crew change-related restrictions. And I think that's not, in our view, it kind of stops the conversation, because first, a lot of them are not entirely aware. And secondly, this isn't an issue where you have a clear culprit who's doing all the damage. It's not an oil spill where you can point to a shipping company and say, your safety protocols were not up to par, and you created this environmental disaster. It's complex. It's it's global. It's multilateral, and we think engagement was the best way to do it. You could blame airlines, but airlines were also struggling based on their own economic situation. So as with most negotiations, the best way to negotiate is not to push the red button. We continue to speak to the companies and ask them where possible to try to reduce that. And by raising awareness, and I pointed out earlier, the biggest issue is with governments. The designation as seafarers is so important in trying to increasing mobility for people to move around. And they have strict protocols in place. And the Maritime Organization has a 12-step protocol that will help limit the spread of COVID while allowing the seafarers to change crew. And that hasn't really been, I think there's a lack of awareness on that. That's what we've been trying to do.
Yeah, thanks. Good to get your to know that exclusion is now not the option, but to keep talking. And you mentioned also the 2 trillion investor statement, of course. And you also mentioned that there's no too little attention from the investor community on this issue before. And did you see this change if you look also to your peers and other investors? And did it systematically improve? So are you alone in those conversations now, or how did it change?
Yeah, so we in general, investors tend to be open-minded and quite helpful. I think most of them have recognized this as an issue, but the priorities for every asset manager is different, and sometimes you have to pick your battles. There are certain large themes that are maybe more pressing, and so we're actually quite grateful that 85 of our peers have joined us in writing a letter to the UN and expressing support for the Seafarers. But like I said, shipping in general is not a very investable sector until much more recently, when you see the stock prices moving up. It's been known to be a cyclical sector. They're commoditized products, and it's fallen off a lot of investors' radars. But hopefully, this issue, I think what we're trying to bring to them is that this is not something shipping alone can solve, and this is not something where investors who don't invest in shipping can ignore, because you invest in 90% of global trade. If you do, then this is going to be an issue for you.
Yeah, and it's also an issue for companies in our investment scope, because everyone is impacted can influence this. There's another question on I think you already touched upon it and your engagement with UN, but you say that the governments have a big role to play, especially as labeling them as key workers. And have you also discussed this with the EU and UN, and what's the current status of that discussion?
Yeah, so we've been mentioning that multiple times. We wrote in the letter to the UN, that was the first big bullet point, and I think writing to the UN was important in showing in raising awareness and showing commitment for the investment community. But the UN through its agencies like the International Maritime Organization (IMO), the International Labour Organization (ILO), they know about this, and they've been trying to get governments to be more engaged. And I think that's something that we're going to continue to stress on. We don't have a lot of pull over the governments, which is why when we appeal to the companies in our portfolio, when we engage with the companies in our portfolio, if they do support the Seafarers, they should try to pull their strings with their local governments in getting the local governments to recognize them as Seafarers. I think that was the approach we took, that we felt where we had the most leverage. So that's been an ongoing thing, and as you can see from the articles, snapshots I've taken 1 year on, there was still a captain that died at sea, and it's been 2 months, and he can't repatriate his body. So this is continues to be a point of frustration for us as we try and alleviate this problem. I think you're on mute, Mart.
Thank you. I think that also limits the influence of the impact of your engagement if it's not labeled as such. So I think it's really important. We also have several investors in this call. So what are vital questions that you asked in the investor engagement to companies in the global trade, but also what can investors mention to the companies that are a bit down the chain or a bit up the chain? How they can influence this? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think one way to frame it is to think about this as you would a retail brand, trying to keep tabs on the sustainability of your supply chains. Seafarers are part of your global supply chain, and there's a certain responsibility, even though it's a couple levels removed from the brands and the charterers, to ensure that they are sustainable. And it's the same things you ask when you do ESG engagements for those supply chains. Do you know about this issue? What have you heard about this problem? How do you ensure the seafarers in your supply chain are not on overworked contracts, are not on overextended contracts? And I think those are some of the key questions we ask. We ask if they're willing to deviate where necessary from the ports. Do you choose shipping companies? Do you choose vessels that have a low rate of overextended contracts? Because this is almost a perfectly competitive industry, right? If a shipping company is not, if you're not willing to deviate, the shipping company cannot ask for a premium to ask you to deviate when another shipping company is willing to follow your rules. If you set the standards, if all the charterers who hire ships stick to a code where you understand and empathize with the seafarers and their working relationships and their overextended clause, then shipping companies will comply, and they will be more than happy to comply and deviate to certain ports. So these are the kind of questions we ask with the charterers of the ships. And I think that's probably the most impactful ones we've had so far.
Yeah. All right. And for the investor statement, did you have specific engagement objectives?
The investor statement, you mean the one to the UN?
Yeah. Or the group of investors that you made and that you engaged with to the global shipping companies. What were the specific engagement objectives?
I think the first one was really to raise awareness. I mentioned earlier that shipping is off the radar for a lot of investors, and if I look around, back then when I was covering shipping, I didn't really find a peer. I don't think there was a buy-side shipping analyst. And if you look at the sell side, many of the shipping analysts are relatively junior because it's not a very attractive sector to cover. And so raising awareness was one. It might have just fell under the radar. Second was trying to make the argument that this was a supply chain issue and not a shipping issue, and that this should be treated with the same importance that you treat a modern slavery, the same way you should treat your supply chains. And I think the third thing was trying to warn them of the potential implications that could happen before it happens. I mentioned ESG in the investment community, as I observed, sometimes tend to be more reactionary. An oil spill happens and people try and figure out what happened. Versus this, I can't relate or correlate extended contracts for seafarers with what happened in the Suez Canal. I can't do that with the oil spill that happened in Qingdao, a couple months ago. But that could be one of the causes or one of the reasons for that, because you have overworked seafarers. So I think we're just trying to put the message out there and hopefully create that engagement. The more investors ask and question their supply chain, their companies, and have their companies ask their supply chains, that will have a chain effect on the sustainability of the supply chains.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Terence, for sharing your story and your work. Any one of the participants wants to get in touch with Terence, let us know. We will link you. Again, thank you, Terence, and I think we will move on now because we still have some miles to cover.
Perfect. Thanks for the time.
Thanks. All right. So let's go to the engagement results for labor conditions in the supply chain. For the second year in a row, we have engaged on the topic of labor conditions in the supply chain, and it's a recurring topic because in our last 26 years of engagement, it has remained one of the ways for companies to directly impact lives and take responsibilities. So we started with looking for code of conduct, and now we look for more of improving the lives in the supply chain. We saw several companies drop in score as some companies decrease transparency in their reporting, but we also implemented stricter scoring for certain criteria. Despite stricter scoring, each sector independently and the entirety of our engagement scope saw progress on the topic of labor conditions supply chain in 2021. We've seen a significant number of learning organizations move to the leading category. This result is indicative of the increasing attention paid to the subject of labor conditions, which is likely to be accelerated by the COVID pandemic and the need for actually knowing your supply chain. As you can see here, this slide categorizes the companies based on the maturity on the steam, as we scored them on our criteria. As you can see, ASR, ABN AMRO, NN Group, Corbion, and RELX have progressed from learning to leading, and Vopak and SVN Offshore progress from lagging to learning. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we've seen an overall improvement on this topic, but also I think it's visible, particularly in the area of passive due diligence, as shown in this graph. For example, the percentage of companies with grievance mechanisms for the supply chains increased 10 percentage points from 2020. And the percentage of companies which tracked responses of suppliers regarding labor rights increased even more, with 11 percentage points. Well, we are pleased to see companies progress on this issue. However, we also recognize that the diligence systems being present do not guarantee that these are the high quality systems necessary to actually improve lives. An example of this is companies that state that grievance mechanisms have been used in 2021. And this is seen as an achievement as no one reported violation. However, the flip side of the coin may well be widespread unawareness of the grievance mechanisms or a lack of faith in these systems. Therefore, a company needs to actively reach out to supply chain partners, supply chain workers, and other partners, such as sector initiatives, NGOs, and local governments, in order to really create a robust due diligence system. But VBDO will continue to look at this in 2022. But let's go to our second speaker. We have invited Elisabetta Colombo from VBDO Iris, which is now part of Moody's ESG solutions. So this year, VBDO and VBDO Iris work together to improve also VBDO's ESG data integration. And the company provided us data to inform our engagement, such as, for example, controversies and more detailed screening on salient topics. So we see companies struggle with proper due diligence and mitigating risks, but also investors are in need of good data and information. Therefore, we think it's valuable to hear more about a rater's perspective. So Elisabetta, can I give the floor to you?
Of course. Hi, Mart, and good morning, everyone. So my name is Elisabetta Colombo, and I'm responsible of the Sustainable Development Goal offer. I would like to thank you, Mart, and to thank VBDO for inviting me to be part of this interesting discussion. And just to give you some context, so VE, as Mart said, has been acquired by Moody's and integrated into the group along with another affiliate for 27. Mart, could you switch the slide? So Moody's ESG solution provides ESG data, climate data, and controversy data to investors. My point of view is the one of an analyst working in a rating agency that guide investors towards sustainable choices. So I'll focus on the role that investee corporates play both as a cause and as a solution of human rights risk. Next slide, please. So let's spend some really brief moments on definition. Human rights risk. So they refer to a very wide area of analysis, and in the methodology, when we talk about a social rating of companies, we refer broadly to the relation of companies with stakeholders as supplier, customers, and local communities. Human rights range from freedom of association, social dialogue, right to physical and mental health, but also prevention of child labor, but also privacy rights of customers. Moreover, like in terms of a relation with communities, human rights relate to right to property of displaced local communities, but also to the protection of human rights where companies use private security forces. So human rights are material for companies and investors as they represent threats to companies' businesses. Companies that have difficult relation with customers, communities, and suppliers might incur in legal and operational risk. Compensation and fines lead, of course, to financial risk for companies, but also for the investors at the end. The methodology is based on the most advanced international standards in terms of respect of human rights, plus some specific initiatives that look at the investor role in this challenge, such as, of course, the UN PRI. The UN Business and Human Rights Guiding Principle, as we know, is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. And we are also at an early stage of the development of the EU mandatory human rights due diligence legislation and also of the social taxonomy. So it's clear that greater pressure will be put on companies regarding human rights management. Could you move the slide? Thank you. So in these slides, we can see how VE methodology is available to help investors to identify companies that have developed strong commitment and policies in terms of human rights protection. Moreover, we analyze if companies have developed human rights due diligence processes. These measures include human rights training programs for employees, impact assessment and audits, investigation of human rights allegation, and provision of access to remedy, as it was said earlier, through grievance mechanism. All these standards measures are, of course, adopted at sector level. So it is very different if we're talking about due diligence for an infrastructure project that deal with the community resettlement, or if we analyze a broadcasting company that has as a main human rights challenge to be transparent on the gathering and use of customer data. Important in all, you could go back to the other, sorry. So important in all cases is the involvement of external specialized stakeholders, such as NGOs and associations that work on human rights. And also, the methodology helps investors to identify the companies that are violating human rights, what we call controversies or allegation. So the same methodological structure, here I presented just for human rights practices, but is applied to analyze the integration of social factor in the supply chain. So in terms of supply chain, we expect companies to develop code of conduct dedicated to suppliers and above all to make sure that social standards are respected. To do that, companies should work internally training their staff in charge of purchase and introducing social factor in contractual clauses with suppliers, but also directly with suppliers, offering training and support. As for human rights, we identified controversies faced by companies in terms of violation of worker rights in the supply chain. So in the next slides, we can see the performance achieved by some sectors in our universe in terms of respect of human rights standard in the society and in terms of integration of social factor in the supply chain. Next slide, please. Okay, so we can start with the extractive industry, and here I noted some focus on the mining sector and the energy sectors, because those sectors are amongst the ones that are mostly exposed to human rights violation. The extraction of minerals or raw materials by extractive companies has exacerbated conflicts in numerous countries around the world. And the sector is facing some specific human rights issues, such as property rights and resettlement, indigenous people, or violation of indigenous people rights, and also problems linked to the use of security forces. Moreover, the global demand for green minerals linked to the wide adoption of green technology has created new challenges for the sectors in terms of responsible mineral sources. According to our methodology, companies in the mining and energy industry achieved limited results when it comes to addressing human rights. As you can see in the slides, the score for at the global level stood at 42 out of 100, and while a slightly better performance has been achieved by European companies. So guidelines on how to address social risk in the sector have been developed, from the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals to legislation such as the Dodd-Frank Act. According to our analysis, most companies have formalized and well-developed human rights policies in place. However, there is still room for improvement as regards the implementation of concrete measures such as indigenous people consultation, resettlement plans, grievance mechanism, and also external human rights audit, so not performed internally by the company. The number of, as you can see in the slide, the number of controversies, so we call controversy any conflicts with the stakeholders. The number of controversies stood at 95 high and critical cases in our universe as of last May. And the controversies range from displacement of a local population to reported abuse by private security forces, including those guarding mining installations. Controversies relate to human rights management affecting the mining and metals and energy sectors are particularly crucial for investors because they put at risk their social license to operate. If we move to the next slide, we can have a better view on the food and beverage industry. So food companies are particularly susceptible to human rights risk, given, of course, their vast and complex supply chains. Stakeholders, including investors, are increasingly interested in the financial risk associated with lax human rights due diligence and supply chain level. Therefore, identifying and addressing risks in order to ensure the respect of ILO's core labor standards at the supply chain level is considered crucial for food companies, especially the ones operating in countries with weak or ineffective implementation of labor rights. It is estimated that 25% of employees, workers in the world, work in agricultural sector, among which over half of all these workers are engaged in informal employment. So given the actual figures, the food industry is defined as a key actor on empowering smallholding farmers and helping those achieving self-enrichment by developing and sharing technologies and skills that improve living standards. Moreover, the food industry usually spread their operation in water-stressed areas and where the respect of property rights is not guaranteed. Companies in the food and beverage industry achieved limited results when it comes to integrating criteria, social criteria among suppliers. As you can see, our score is at 36 out of 100, with a better performance again achieved by European companies. The number of controversy is lower compared to the previous sector, but this is also due to the number of companies we analyze in each sector. And here we have 23 high and critical cases as of last May for this kind of company. So exploitative employment condition, including excessive working hours with low wages, are constantly observed. One of the most common allegations faced by companies in our universe is the exploitation of workers in the palm oil production in Indonesia and Malaysia. Another well-known issue is linked to the labor condition in the fish industry in Thailand. So not only seafarers, but also, of course, workers in the fish industries, as Terence highlighted, and paying living wages, right to collective bargain, and elimination of child labor represent the main challenges in the supply chain of this industry. A last example is from the financial sector industry. Thank you for Mart. That show also a limited performance in addressing the respect of human rights, standing at 36 out of 100, and a better performance when we analyzed European companies. Indeed, the score stood at 45 out of 100. Discussions about the human rights responsibilities of banks and insurance focus mostly on their stance towards corporate clients operating in high-risk sector or countries. Financial companies as lenders and investors are expected to respect and promote human rights in their activities. And the international community produced a robust corpus of international norms and standards, among them the Equator Principle, but also national initiative, as you know, as the Dutch banking sector agreement that was, of course, a multi-stakeholder agreement between Dutch bank, trade unions, civil society, and the Dutch government, through which the parties agreed to work towards full implementation of by banks of human rights responsibilities. Most of the companies analyzed by VE issue a formalized and public commitment on the respect of human rights and put in place a relevant risk assessment procedure to integrate human rights consideration in their businesses activities. However, only like a minority of the company set grievance mechanism through which stakeholders affected can voice their concern directly to the bank or to the insurance companies. The number of controversies for the sector is very high, as it stood at 111 high and critical cases in our universe as of last May. And these allegations are linked to involvement in financing projects causing adverse human rights impact. And interestingly, a recent report just published from Fair Finance Guide Netherlands examined 11 cases of Dutch insurers that invest more than 4 billion euros in 11 multinationals corporations directly involved in serious and long-term human rights violation. The investee companies are oil and gas and mining companies such as Shell, Total, and Glencore. And that are notoriously involved in land grabbing, pollution of rivers, impacting, of course, drinking water, but and also very serious violation when it comes to employee representatives in developing countries. Last slide, please. So far, I referred to the behavior of companies, but investors can also rely on another kind of analysis when it comes to evaluating the impact of their investment. Rating agencies such as B helps investors to identify companies that are involved in the offer of products and services that can be classified as sustainable. So here on the left side of the slide, I listed some of the themes that are more linked to social improvements in the society, such as health and food and nutrition. While on the other side, we can see that investors can perform negative screening. So the exclusion we were talking about earlier could be arrived after a negative screening, not only on the behavior, as we saw in the previous slide, but also a negative screening on the core businesses of the company. So some investors might want to exclude the companies that are not involved in businesses that are not aligned with their principle. If we talk about human rights, for instance, companies involved in weapons, or even companies involved in gambling could be excluded by certain investors. So to conclude, addressing human rights and improve the labor condition of workers through the supply chain can align investors' strategies with the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of the goals, some of the SDGs clearly look at human rights challenges, such as ensuring education, goal 4, or ensuring housing, or achieving gender equality, goal 5, or decent work, if we think about goal 8. But apart from these goals referring specifically to human rights topics, we cannot forget the intersectionality of the topics. Indeed, the respect of human rights accompany the 17 sustainable challenges set by the SDGs, and human rights need to be taken into consideration also when we fight climate change or when we stimulate economic growth. So I would stop here. Thank you for listening. And please, if you have, I haven't checked yet the box, if you have any question.
Thank you, Elisabetta, for your story. And it's always interesting also to see how a rater looks at this, and because you're in between the companies and the investors. So I think also the questions that came into the chat is also on the sources that you use. And the first question is from Ilonka de Beer. What are your sources for the allegations in the sector? And I think a question for me also is, how do you categorize controversies from low to high? What's your system within? Could you elaborate on that?
Of course. Okay, the sources we rely on when we conduct the review of companies, so the analysis of the ESG behavior of companies, we rely only on publicly available information. Concretely means that we rely on the published annual report, 10K sustainability report, code of conduct for suppliers, as we were talking about the supply chain, but and also all the dedicated policies. But as a crucial part of our analysis, we also engage directly with companies. So when we perform the first review, we contact companies that we analyze, and in our universe at the moment we are analyzing 5,000 companies, and the number will double next year. So we contact directly through a platform these rated companies and check with them if they have additional information to share. Let's say the rationale is that this additional information that might be shared only internally for the moment, because one of the main problems, as we know, especially for the medium enterprise, is about disclosure, not about having the policy in place. So I was saying that if they share with us additional information, we should be able to share the information with investors. So it's, in a way, it's never confidential information. It's confidential it's information that maybe were kept internal, but that now the companies are willing to share. Regarding your second question on controversies, we have a dedicated team that performs an analysis of controversies and a monitoring of controversies on a daily basis. So the score is impacted in terms of controversy. The score of companies rated is impacted very often, means on a daily basis, and will also contact investors with some alerts if particularly, especially critical events occurs. About the definition, as I said, and the classification of controversies, as I said, controversies are for us any kind of conflicts with stakeholders. So this, of course, covers like legal procedures, but not only. If the stakeholder that raised the concern is considered by us trustable and reliable, it could be also a protest from trade unions, of course, or also information that we received by NGOs, or NGOs campaign or a specific topic. And about the severity of the controversies, for us is really critical to understand if the problem occurred once, just because the companies had, of course, like big listed companies are all involved in conflicts with stakeholders. So for us, it is really important to check the frequency of controversies, to check the responsibility, meaning it was a problem related to an individual employees, or as we saw with Volkswagen, the whole board was well aware of the problem. And of course, the last matrix is the last factor is the impact on stakeholders. So how was the controversy detrimental to the final stakeholders? And stakeholders for us is also the environment, so not only communities or workers.
Okay, clear. And perhaps to make a link to Terence's presentation, he also talks about people without a voice, or people that don't have a voice and are in a supply chain where perhaps there's no control, or not an NGO that can grow their voices or share their concerns. So how do you look at those hidden workers, or is that something that you look at or that you can identify?
Okay, when it comes to, for instance, financed project for us, and I saw also you mentioned it in your presentation. For us, it is really important to check the presence of grievance mechanism through which stakeholders affected can directly contact the banks who is that is financing the project. And when it comes to the supply chain, again, it is really important to for us to see if the company is working with suppliers also involving external third-party auditors, for instance, or NGOs that can help the companies to improve its analysis and its assessment of the issue. So yes, when a third-party NGOs, association, and stakeholders forums are involved, we are, let's say, more reassured about the quality of due diligence on the supply chain.
Yeah, all right. I can imagine. And another question from Adrie Heinsbroek is also partly connected to this. So he says, the role of NGOs on information on business practices was mentioned. Do you witness a growing acceptance of the info or reports used of NGOs by investors? Curious if this is, in your view, only as additional info or also as part of their ESG due diligence?
No, I would not say that is merely additional information, because as I was saying at the beginning, for controversy, really the important factor for us is to have a reliable stakeholder, and it could be an NGO or a trade union or a forum focusing on a specific issue. And yes, so I would say that we witness a growing acceptance of information coming from relevant stakeholders, also because they are the one working specifically on some topics and having like really some granularity that other stakeholders might not have.
Yeah. Okay. Clear. Yeah, also a question from VBDO, because this is something that we struggle with, is the fact that we see a lot of policies, we see a lot of systems, programs, but how do you as VE evaluate if companies are proactively improving labor conditions in the supply chain? And yeah, what are you specifically looking for? Perhaps you have a good practice, or you can.
Yes, I was checking in our database about like some good practices in terms of supply chain among the sector we mentioned, and I saw the I score of Coca-Cola, and this is not surprising, because it's of course like a very strong companies, and so of course the scores is also influenced by the very transparent level of disclosure on this topic. And so looking at this example, I was checking why the score of Coca-Cola was so high in our database. And what I saw is that they disclose a supplier guiding principles. So they have a policy, first of all. And this policy address the topic of freedom of association, right to collective bargain, abolition of child labor, abolition of forced labor, non-discrimination, health and safety, decent wage, and working hours. So all those topics are addressed, at least in the commitment, when it comes to dealing with suppliers. And also, not only in terms of commitment, but in terms of measures. So they communicate labor requirements to suppliers. They integrate labor issue into contractual clauses, and they perform risk assessment. they check, they use like a sharing platform to share best practices among suppliers. So they are in direct contact with the suppliers supporting them. And also, as I was said before, they have a third-party audit of their suppliers, and this is something that we do not see that frequently for beverage companies. Well, just if I can add something, what is I mean, our challenge as a rating agency is to understand why sometimes companies that have like such strong commitment and measure are still involved, as we all know, in controversy. So I think that like the adoption of mandatory regulation, as the EU is trying to do, will help everyone to solve this issue a bit. I mean, to understand better what's the problem when you have strong policy and strong measures and still controversy in place.
Yeah, I hope it will motivate a lot of companies to actually improve labor conditions. But thank you for these insights, and thank you for your talk. I think we also need to move on, but if you have other questions for Elisabetta, please post them in the chat, and we will make sure that we will get you the answer. But thanks again, Elisabetta. And
thank you.
I hope
thank
you
you for inviting. Of course.
Thank you. All right. But we still have a little bit more than half an hour, and we will go back to the engagement results for diversity, and we also have another important and interesting speaker. Let's first go to the engagement results. So diversity and inclusion was a very significant topic in 2020, and it continued to be in 2021. This year we again saw Black Lives Matter protests and also increasingly protests against sexual and domestic violence against women across the world. Well, we have identified increased awareness of the salience of this topic among our engagement scope. But this awareness does not always translate to concrete action and measures towards actually improving diversity and inclusion. However, VBDO does acknowledge that companies are increasingly building knowledge of this topic within the company through, for example, training programs, which you see more often, as well as some leaders becoming more informed through data, which of course is a challenge through regulation, but we do see that they're innovating with different types of programs. If we look at this Sankey diagram, we see upwards and downwards movements across categories. And we believe that the negative movements are partly due to also us being more strict on categories and our criteria across the line. And yeah, we don't see necessarily that companies are decreasing performance. Please click one further. I think we do see things moving, and this is also reflected in the fact that ASER, personnel, and RELEX proceeded from learning to leading this year, and FOPAC proceeded from lagging to learning. It should also be noted that in its first year in our scope, IGN immediately ranked in the learning category, which is quite an accomplishment. However, we do see that the industry sector and the technology and electronic sector are still lagging a bit behind compared to other sectors, but this may be expected from the historical underrepresentation of women in these sectors. But of course, it's not an excuse. If we look at two specific elements of our engagements, we've seen an overall increase in performance regarding diversity policies and practices. In particular, VBDOs noted a different approach to this topic, from one seen as merely mandatory ESG issue to more of a driver of success and innovation, which we read more often in annual reports. The first trend that should be highlighted is the increased percentage of companies with a comprehensive diversity policy, from 35% in 2020 to 51% in 2021. And we actively look for policies that include all forms of diversity on all organizational levels. And that's beyond the PDF solely stressing the importance of gender diversity in boards, for example, as we still sometimes see. Whereas policies are now in place for the majority of companies in our scope, we do witness a lack of strategic approaches to improve diversity and inclusion. Actions still often seem a bit standalone and generic, rather than really addressing identified problems. The second important aspect of our engagement concerns the gender pay gap, of which the Dutch average is still sadly 14%. VBDO is glad to see that a 10% increase in the percentage of companies assessing, reporting, and addressing the gender pay gap from 22% in 2020 to 32% in 2021. We continue to encourage companies in reporting on the gender pay gap. Also, we are curious when we will see the first gap analysis in the Netherlands on a topic other than gender, which I think some companies in our scope are experimenting with. Well, again, we look forward to engage on this topic in the next year in 2022. But let's go to our next slide. We have a speaker on diversity and inclusion. And we found that a large share of the companies within our scope are still struggling with their diversity and inclusion strategy. And we think Robert's experience can really inspire today. But before I forget, Robert, I want to congratulate you, as you have been recognized as one of the 30 inclusive leaders in the Netherlands. And yeah, could you perhaps shortly introduce yourself, and also it's interesting to hear what you've been working on lately.
Okay, thank you, Mart, and good morning, everyone. First of all, Terence and Elisabetta, thank you for your inspiration and the stories you told before. And well, thank you for the congratulations. It was a very nice surprise to be the best 30 in the Netherlands, and it was completely, it surprised me. It was very nice. Okay, my name is Robert Tucken, and I'm working as the Diversity and Inclusion Manager at PostNL in the Netherlands. PostNL is a logistic company with more than 40,000 employees, and we are focused on the mail and parcel delivery. We have more than 130 nationalities at PostNL, and nearly 50% of our employees are women. So big company, and as you can see, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's long term. You can see it on the first slide. It's long-term thinking and long-term acting, and I will show you more in this presentation. And we see diversity as a starting point and inclusiveness as the final destination. And we want to reach that in 2025. Okay, next slide, please. And then you have to click. There they are all. Okay. What exact is our diversity policy? What do we stand for? These are questions we are asked ourselves a few years ago, and we have built our diversity and inclusion policy on 6 pillars, so as you can see. The first one is acceptance of one's own individuality. We are very aware that this acceptance is by no means self-evident in many countries. So we have a very active pride network that focus on this pillar. For example, we have 6 buses driving through the Netherlands, and they are in rainbow colors. We get a lot of positive reaction on this. Everyone can see in the Netherlands that everyone counts. Very important for us. But something else about this theme. Recently, I walked around in a sorting center, and I saw a man with tears in his eyes. And I asked him if he was okay. Yes, he was okay, but he was reading a flyer from our Pride network. And he told me that he had to fled to the Netherlands. In his native country, homosexuality was punishable by death. And now he read this flyer and he got emotional. He lives in a country and works at a company where this is not an issue at all. So, as you can see on this theme, our Pride network is elementary. The second one, of course, every company wants to have the right mix of different ages. For example, we have our young personnel network that focus on this target group. And the target group is under the age of 30. However, we have also have policies that enable older people to continue working for longer. So that's the second focus point in our diversity and inclusion policy. Then third, last year we have invested a lot of in diversity and thinking power. But what is thinking power? Well, every person has a unique combination of communication and thinking styles and skills. In addition, everyone has their own personal motivations. And we can visualize this with 3D analysis. So we ensure balanced teams. Then we have the fourth, the multicultural diversity. I told you earlier, we have more than 130 nationalities, and PostNL is a rich mix of cultural diversity. We also provide many training courses to bring cultures closer together. For example, we provide training courses, multicultural craftsmanship, and intercultural communication. The average rating for these trainings is above 9. But what are these trainings? Well, I will give an example. The training courses provide a wonderful insight into the interaction between different cultures. Suppose that you were born in the Netherlands with Dutch parents. You grow up then in an open culture. But suppose that you were born in the Netherlands and you have Turkish parents. In that case, you get a completely different mental programming. There's no right or wrong between them. However, there are many differences. In the training courses, we teach people to deal with these differences with respect. And the average rating of these trainings is above 9, so it's very impactful. Number 5, gender equality, balanced male and female ratio. In terms of gender diversity, PostNL is one of the best performing organizations in the Netherlands. For example, we have more than 40% women in the highest management level. The proportion of women in the supervisory board is also above 40%. And one of the less countries in the Netherlands, we have a female CEO, a good role model. And then number 6 of our focus points. Finally, we also committed to giving people with a distance to the labor market opportunities. Entire process components have been outsourced and work is performed by people from this target group. Okay, next slide, please. We try to base all decisions we made on proven facts. A few years ago, it was not easy because there were many things we had no knowledge of. We therefore started to innovate ourselves. In 2016, we conducted a diversity survey for the first time. We developed this research ourselves, and you will see more about it in this presentation. We already saw in 2016 that we have an attention point. We are successful in recruiting people with a multicultural background. However, we saw that this target group was not well represented at the top. We were also not the only company in the Netherlands who had this problem, so we started researching this scientifically. Together with other companies and the Free University of Amsterdam, we started a scientific study in 2017 that will complete it next February. Then the third one you can see. In 2018, we removed the origin of all our employees from our HR systems. After all, it's not about your origin, religion, or sexual orientation. We are searching for your unique qualities that you bring. But how do we know how our population is built up? Partly due PostNL, the Cultural Diversity Barometer has been in existence since 2020, and we can request this data from the Central Bureau of Statistics in the Netherlands. So these are all facts in our diversity policy. You can click on to the next slide, please. When we're talking about our diversity survey, that was a unique research. Because in the Netherlands, we have a new privacy legislation and that has been placed in 2018. Companies are not allowed to simply capture unique personality traits. So we have worked for 15 months to make diversity survey, our diversity survey privacy proof. It's a unique survey in the Netherlands, and in the meantime, there are large companies that ask us for this expertise. I think you are curious about this structure of our research, and you can click to the next slide. First of all, the main points. We compare to 2016, and you see we have a significant step forward with regard to the diversity index. An improve of 50% is a great result. But what does this actually say? Well, we go to the deep dive and we go to the next slide. Our diversity survey is made up on 3 parts, and we have developed a questionnaire that is made on 3 elements: acceptance, inclusiveness, and diversity. And as you can see, we have shown a nice improvement on all 3 points. In particular, the feeling of inclusivity has increased significantly, 23%. That latter is very important because it means people feel connected at PostNL and therefore more committed to our company. How we build up the diversity index, as you can see the percentage of acceptance, inclusiveness, and diversity, and you add it up and then divide it by 3, and then you have the diversity index. And at the moment, it's 79%. Further, we go to the deep dive further in the D&I survey. We can see very well in the results how certain components or groups have scored. This is very important in order to develop a targeted policy. Each business unit had its own point of attention. For example, in the Netherlands, the mail organization is a shrinking part, but also has grown considerably the last years. This means different plans of approach. We can see very well the results how certain components and groups have scored. This is important in order to able to develop target policy. Each business unit had its own points of attention. What questions have we asked our employees? The first set of questions is about acceptance. And as you can see, we asked our employees, are you accepted by your colleagues? Are you accepted by your supervisor? And can you be completely yourself in your own department? 90% of the employees of PostNL feel completely acceptance. This is a nice score, but we continue to work hard on the 10% who feel less accepted. We have made huge gains in inclusiveness across all business units and target groups. We have also invested a lot the last 4 years in all kinds of programs, and this is paying off, as you can see, because the questionnaire about inclusiveness is in my department, men and women are given equal opportunities. Colleagues from other cultures are treated equally. You can be open about your sexual orientation. And colleagues with disabilities can function equally. This is a nice step forward. And I will show you how it becomes. Then the last questions in our questionnaire is about diversity. We regard to diversity, and we asked our employees themselves to see the value of diversity. As you can see, it's nicely forward, but also work to do. The questionnaire about this one is diversity in our department contributes to better results, better decision making, and a better atmosphere. 68%. Further, you can see we have 3 networks, and these networks they are inside of the people. The Pride Network is the most famous one in PostNL. Young PostNL is to 37% knows what Young PostNL is. And WIN, that stands for Women Inclusion Network. And they have some remarkable results. Okay, you can go to another slide. Yeah, and then how do we achieve all these results? I give a brief overview. The diversity survey was first established in 2016 with focus areas where we want to focus on. The 6 pillars I mentioned earlier. Then our D&I policy is rewritten. That's the 6 pillars. But then the second one, new business principles. The new business principles are very important and have been tightened up. We worked with the pluralism model. An example here. Suppose you have an employee who, from a religious point of view, does not want to work under a gay manager. Then you have a problem. Religion and sexual orientation are protected by law. Our business principles state that when one part excludes the other, the exclusive party loses its rights. So we have the employee working on a religious point, and he said, I don't want to work on a gay manager, but he excluded. So he has the problem with in PostNL. That's how our pluralism model works. And we have already been able to solve many dilemmas with this. Now, as you can see in this slide, we have changed our communication strategy. We're always a bit reactive and therefore often too late. Nowadays, we are open to journalists and we tell our successes, but we also tell what we found difficult. And when you see PostNL in the press, it's always nuanced. I can't find a word, but the journalists are very well respected in this point of view. Then the training and advice. We also developed our own training programs because they simply did not exist. I told you more about the multicultural mastery, but we have other programs. A program we called Into the Future with Confidence, or Growing Successfully Together, based on the insights of Stephen Covey. Then we developed and supported our own training programs, strategic management, cross-border solution recruitment. They have their own training programs. The networks, I'll talk you more about the networks, Pride Network, Women Inclusion Network, Young PostNL, very, very important for our diversity step up. Also, our CEO is a keynote speaker at national events. So everyone knows PostNL, diversity and inclusion is very important for PostNL. We have knowledge sharing sessions with other companies. And then, yeah, when we go to the last block, In addition to the fact that we consider it's a social responsible theme, D&I is a business case. For example, I'm thinking of some marketers we hired a few years ago with a multicultural background. They are now bringing in millions of trade through the halal market. So it's a really business case. And when you see the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, all questions about diversity and inclusion give us a higher score in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So we created value for personnel on that. Now, exposure, we won several awards on a diversity and inclusion policy. So we are leading on this point in the Netherlands. And then the last slide, please. As I told you, diversity and inclusion is more than a business case for us. PostNL invested a lot in diversity and inclusion, and it's already brought us a lot. It's certainly not an easy road because it also brings tensions with it. There are a number of things that are necessary. First one, persistent leadership. The second one, connecting leadership. And the third one, empathic leadership. And this kind of leadership in combination with good data and targeted policy, there's a lot to gain to be made. Our credo, therefore, is it's precisely because of our differences we make the difference. So thank you for your attention for this one. And now I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Robert.
The back slides are in this presentations, or you're sending with the?
Yeah, they are.
Oh, yeah. In the black slides, you can see, of course, we're thinking about diversity and inclusion. We have our vision, we have our statement. We see the importance, and we do our research. When you click on. Here you can see the diversity and inclusion vision, but these kinds of things you're sending to all the participants, Mart, I believe.
Yeah, in a PDF version. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your story, Robert. We've had several discussions on this in the past couple of weeks and months, and I think the increase in score is amazing on the diversity index. So I think it's very impressive. Also, what I really think is unique is the dilemma solving, and because it really changes the narrative. If you have a problem with someone and you're excluding them, then it's your problem. I think that's very unique in what we see. Yeah, I think what's also interesting for our participants is you have a lot of data, and you have a lot of networks. And you also give a lot of examples of measures, trainings, etc. So how do you determine which of these measures are most appropriate for your organization? And how do you use these measures for a really comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategy? What kind of steps do you take?
Yeah. Good question, Mart. The diversity index shows the difference very nicely. But what makes it so valuable? I'll give you an example. 99% of our people at the head office do not experience any barrier of expressing their own sexual orientation. This percentage is 78% the production environment. Mm-hmm. So our Pride Network, it's a clear direction for our Pride Network to where the focus lies. You don't have to put much energy in the head office, but we put our energy in the production environment. When you are not seeing a sufficient in-cultural transfer in certain business units. So when we look at that point, our talent management department runs extra programs there. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, definitely. All right. I also see a question in the chat from Stephanie. Hi, Robert. Did you work with other companies in building the D&I program? What would be your advice to other companies to improve D&I in their organizations?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we work with other companies. I told you about the scientific. Well, we work with the university in Amsterdam, but we work there together with Randstad, Rabobank, and we call that program More Color at the Top because we have the same problems. So we're working together on that one. The advice, yeah, you ask for advice. First of all, yeah, first you have to have data is essential. When I'm looking at that question, you have data, but don't think that you can't do this survey because we have the privacy legacy in the Netherlands. First of all, don't assume that there's a lot not allowed. We consulted with the government and explained the importance of good diversity research. Of course, we also see the importance of strict privacy regulation. By entering into a conversation, you become to surprising solutions. The Dutch government sees the importance of good research, and we see the importance of strict privacy legislation. As you can see, I'm not a native English speaker. We found and helped each other on this. We also helped the Dutch companies to set up such an investigation. In fact, PostNL is setting a new standard on this one. And we're also willing to share our knowledge. This meeting is an example of this. I hope this is a question for Stephanie. The answer is enough for you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Robert. I can imagine also that you have the survey, which is kind of like numerical data, percentages, stuff like that. But I think diversity inclusion can also be a very sensitive topic and very delicate. So how do you gain more of the qualitative data and really the specific issues that are within the different networks or groups or departments within PostNL?
First of all, we work a lot on awareness, Mart. By example, we publish a magazine for all our employees in which we regularly pay attention to corporate social responsibility. And diversity and inclusion is one of the issues. We also regularly submit dilemmas, and I give you some examples. For example, gender neutral toilets, yes or no? And we talk about with people with employees. But another one, what are the difference between a shame and a guilt culture? All these kind of questions, we created awareness around the theme. And you get real changes when you talk about it with each other. It's always about a conversation. The conversations can sometimes be spicy, yeah, that's right. But it also makes it very valuable. So yeah, it's delicate, but you have to talk about it with your people in the organization, and we publish a lot in our magazines. So yeah, that's one of the things we do. Not only training, but always get attention to these points.
Yeah. So really reacting, but also being proactive and putting the dilemmas out there.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious. Do you now have gender neutral toilets at PostNL? Is it something that was?
We have started with gender neutral toilets, okay. But yeah, you have discussion because not everyone likes gender neutral. But there are small steps, and about a couple of years, everyone can see. Okay, at home, we don't make a difference between men and women toilets. So it's little steps
Yeah.
Diversity and inclusion is always long term. In small steps, bringing it further.
Yeah, bring the bias down.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, my final question for today is how do you use, because you mentioned like people are resistant to change in some cases. So it's often you give examples. What are other measures to engage employees to building support for actions or policies?
Yeah, can you repeat that one, Mart? Because I was talking with someone else to me.
Oh yeah, no worries, no worries. Yeah, so you said we're giving examples to our employees. For example, they have gender neutral toilets at their own homes. What are other measures for employees to engage employees to build support for the measures and the actions that you're taking?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of issues around the diversity and inclusion. One example we have for the people born in the Netherlands, we have Sinterklaasfeest. That's one of the issues here. And when we go into the west of the Netherlands and we're talking about Zwarte Piet, there's no issue there. We have now colored. There are colored now. But in the east of the Netherlands, it's small steps forwards, but we have made last steps there. We don't want to see Zwarte Piet anymore at PostNL. But it are small steps. We started 4 years ago, this discussion, and step by step, it's now not longer an issue at PostNL. That's one of the examples I can give to you. But there are a lot of examples around this thing.
Yeah, I can imagine. Very interesting job that you have, and in our conversation you shared a lot of examples, and there are enough. So thank you for your time and your presentation. Yeah, if there's any other questions, I will direct them to you. But for now, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin.
All
Thank
right.
you for the invitation.
Always. Yeah, so we're almost at the end of the session. We have 3 minutes left, and yeah, we managed to do it in 2 hours. But that was it for today. And of course, we've shared a short summary of our report. But again, I do invite you to have a look at our report and download it from our website. But as a special thanks to our speakers today, and as a token of appreciation, we will donate funds on your name to NGO of choice. So I'll get back to you on that. But I would also like to thank our participants today, our highly committed VBDO sector committees, and of course our 2 amazing engagement interns, Mattia and Leonora. And participants, please reach out to us if you would like to be linked to one of the speakers, or if you have additional questions on our engagement results or one of the presentations. And then nothing rests me to wish you all a great day, and I hope to see you at the next VBDO event. Thank you.